On a Friday morning in July of 1993, the Alamance County USDA office in Waukon, Iowa, received its 38th consecutive day of rainfall reports. The upper Mississippi River was at flood stage from Minnesota to Missouri. The levees along the Iowa-Illinois border had been failing since June. The national news had stopped counting which ones. But the story that nobody was covering that morning was not happening at the river. It was happening on the hillsides east of Waukon, where 6 weeks of rain had been doing something slow and invisible and permanent to the sloped ground of northeast Iowa. The topsoil was moving. Not all of it, and not all at once, but on the hillside farms that ran their rows straight up and down the slope, the way every modern farming manual said to run them, the water was finding the furrows between the rows and following them downhill. And it was not going alone. On one farm, it was not moving at all. To understand what the summer of 1993 revealed about the hillside farms of Alamance County, you need to understand what had been standard practice on those farms for 30 years, and why it had seemed like progress at the time. Straight row farming came to northeast Iowa with the post-war machinery boom. A tractor that drives in a straight line is faster, simpler to operate, and easier to calibrate for seed spacing and fertilizer application. A field with straight rows can be planted in a day that would have taken 3 with the older practices. By the early 1960s, every serious corn operation in the county had converted. The Extension Office recommended it. The implement dealers built their pitch around it. The aerial photographs of the county, taken by the USDA for program compliance, showed field after field of straight, parallel lines running up the hillsides in clean, geometric order. It looked like efficiency. For 25 years, it produced like efficiency. The problem was water. Water does not respect property lines or farming calendars. Water follows gravity, and gravity on a 6% slope does not negotiate. When rain falls on bare or thinly covered soil and cannot absorb into the ground fast enough, it becomes runoff. And runoff on a hillside with straight furrows running up and down the slope does not spread out across the field. It concentrates. It finds the lowest point in each furrow and follows it downhill, picking up speed as it goes. Here is the physics that every farmer in Alamance County knew, but none had been required to think about carefully since the last major flood. The erosive power of moving water increases not in proportion to its speed, but as the square of its speed. Water moving twice as fast carries 4 times the sediment load. Water moving 3 times as fast carries 9 times the load. In the first week of July, 1993, rainfall across northeast Iowa reached 24 inches over 6 weeks, more than twice the seasonal average. The ground was saturated. Runoff rates were 3 to 4 times normal. And on the straight-row hillside farms east of Waukon, the furrows that had seemed like a detail of convenience had become channels, and the channels had become small rivers. And the small rivers were carrying the top 4, 5, 6 inches of Iowa farmland downhill toward the Mississippi. On the second week of heavy rain, Dale Schrupp walked his south field and found runnels carved into the ground between his corn rows. Channels 4 inches deep, a foot wide, running straight down the slope like someone had drawn them with a ruler. He called the county extension office. The extension agent told him there was nothing to be done until the rain stopped. "We are watching 50 years of topsoil move down the Mississippi in one summer," a USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service officer wrote in a field report that July. He was not wrong, but he was not looking at the right farm. That same Friday morning, 3 miles east on a county road that curved with the terrain the way county roads in hill country do, an Oliver 77 gasoline tractor came out of a machine shed and turned uphill. Let me tell you about Virgil Luxinger, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his ground looked like in July of 1993. Virgil was 74 years old and had farmed 310 acres in Alamaki County, Iowa, for 43 years. He had come back from Korea in 1952, taken over the farm from his father Ernst the following spring, and had not changed the fundamental shape of what he was doing on that ground since. He paid cash for seed. He paid cash for equipment. He had cleared the last note on the land in 1964 and had not discussed credit with a bank officer since. Virgil Luxinger was not a man who farmed what looked good from the road. He was a man who farmed what the ground told him to farm. And the ground on his hillsides had been telling him the same thing for 40 years. From the county road, his farm did not look like the other farms. The rows curved. They bent around the contours of the hillside, following lines of equal elevation the way a topographic map looked when you drew it in corn and wheat instead of ink. From a distance, and especially from an airplane, the fields looked disorganized, as if whoever was driving the tractor couldn't hold a straight line. Dale Schrupp had said exactly that at the Farm Bureau picnic in 1967. Virgil had been hearing some version of it ever since. He checked his contour strips every morning after rain. That Friday morning in July, he had walked the upper wheat strip before breakfast and found it standing exactly where it was supposed to stand. Virgil's father, Ernst Luxinger, had started farming the contours in the spring of 1931. Ernst had come to Iowa from the canton of Appenzell in Switzerland in 1911, and he had brought with him a particular attention to the relationship between slope and water that any man who had grown up in a mountain farming community carried as a matter of necessity. In Switzerland, you farmed the contour, or you didn't farm at all. The hills would not permit otherwise. In Alamaki County in 1931, a young USDA Soil Erosion Service officer named Harold Brewer had driven through the county and stopped at 6 farms to talk about what the new agency was calling conservation farming. Ernst Luxinger was the only farmer who invited him in for coffee and asked him to come back the following week. Of the 6, he was the only one who changed his practice. He paid $42 for a surveying level and spent one August learning to walk the contours, the invisible lines of equal elevation that ran across his hillsides parallel to the horizon, neither climbing nor descending. He marked them with stakes. He plowed along them the following spring for the first time. The rows curved. They looked strange. His neighbor to the west came over to the fence line and asked if the level was broken. Ernst told him the level was fine. Let me tell you about contour strip farming, because it is the quiet architecture of this story. The method works by dividing a hillside into alternating bands of row crops and small grains or grass, bands that run across the slope rather than down it. On Virgil's farm, the strips were between 80 and 120 feet wide, depending on the steepness of the ground. A strip of corn would be followed by a strip of oats or wheat or brome grass, then corn again, alternating from the valley bottom to the ridge, in a pattern that Ernst had designed in 1931 and that Virgil had modified only slightly in 4 decades. The strips followed the contour lines, the same elevation all the way across the hillside. This meant the rows curved. On a hill with an irregular shape, and Alamaki County's hills are all irregular, the curves were pronounced and different in every field. No two fields had the same pattern. From the air, Virgil's farm looked like the inside of a fingerprint. From the ground, it looked like someone who understood something that the people driving straight had missed. The equipment Virgil used to plant and tend his strips was a 1949 Massey Harris Model 22 tractor, a smaller machine than most of his neighbors ran, built the same year NATO was founded and the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear device. The Model 22 had a tight turning radius that allowed Virgil to follow the curves of the contour lines without overshooting at the ends of the strip. Larger, more powerful tractors could not make the same turns. Virgil had looked at newer equipment twice and decided against it both times, not because of price, but because the turning radius was wrong. He had also kept his father's 1942 John Deere Model L for the narrow work at the end of strips where the curves tightened near the ridge. The L weighed 1,550 pounds and could turn in its own length. Ernst had bought it new for $525. Virgil had rebuilt the carburetor in 1968 and the magneto in 1979. Everything else was original. Every spring before planting, Virgil walked each contour line and restaked any point that had shifted from frost heave or equipment pressure. He reset the markers. He confirmed the elevations matched. He had done this every spring since 1952. He had always known his ground held differently than his neighbor's ground. After every heavy rain, he walked his strips and watched the water behavior, how it spread laterally along the wheat strips instead of channeling downhill, how it slowed and spread and sank instead of accelerating toward the field's lowest point. He had watched this for 40 years. He had watched it from the tractor seat, from the field edge, from the ridge above. He had never once seen his topsoil run. He knew what was happening on the other farms when the rain came hard. He had always known. He just had not been asked to explain it to anyone who was willing to listen. The remark that followed Virgil Luxinger for the next 26 years was made at the Alamaki County Farm Bureau annual picnic in August of 1967 at the fairgrounds outside Waukon. Dale Schrupp had organized the picnic committee that year. He was 42 years old, farmed 480 acres on the hillside adjacent to the Luxinger place, and had converted his entire operation to straight-row moldboard plow farming in 1961. His yields in the 5 years since had been the highest in his township. He drove a 1966 International Harvester 1206, one of the most powerful tractors in the county. And he wore this fact lightly but consistently, the way a man wears a watch he knows people notice. The conversation turned to aerial photography. The USDA had been flying compliance photographs that spring, and several farmers had received their prints. Someone mentioned that Virgil's farm looked unusual from the air. Schrupp picked it up from there. "Virgil's still farming his daddy's curves," he said, loudly enough for the surrounding tables. "Man's got 310 acres of the prettiest contoured mess you ever saw from an airplane." He paused for the laugh. He got it. Somebody ought to tell him the tractor goes straight now. The name stuck. Within a week, the phrase, "farming the curves," had attached itself to Virgil Luxinger, at the elevator, at the feed store, at the extension office, where it was repeated with the particular affection people reserve for eccentricity that harms only the eccentric. Virgil did not respond. He hadn't complained when Schrupp said it in front of 40 people at the fairgrounds. He hadn't complained when it became the thing people said when they drove past his place and saw the curved rows from the road. He hadn't even complained in 1971 when a young county extension agent drove out specifically to suggest that contour farming was inefficient on modern equipment and that Virgil might consider a transition plan. He had listened to the extension agent for 20 minutes. Then he had walked the man to the field edge and pointed at the wheat strip on the second contour. "See where the water goes after a rain," Virgil said. "Come back after the next one. Bring a notebook." The extension agent did not come back. At the picnic, after Schrupp's remark, Virgil had finished his lemonade and set the cup down on the table. "Rain doesn't go straight," he said, to no one in particular. Then he stood up and went to get more potato salad. "Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been told that the way you do something looks wrong? Not because it doesn't work, but because it doesn't look like everyone else's version of right. Have you ever had the shape of your work used against you? The curve of it, the irregular edge of it, the fact that it follows something real rather than something straight and convenient, by someone who was measuring with a ruler when the ground required something else entirely? Have you ever known, in the particular quiet way you know things you've watched for decades, that the straight line everyone else was following was going to run out of ground eventually? Virgil Luxinger had known this since 1952. He had walked it every spring. He had watched the water after every rain. He had kept his stakes and his contour lines and his curved rows, while everyone around him drove straight and called the curves a deficiency. He was still walking those contours on the morning of July 9th, 1993, when the rain that had been falling for 38 days had not yet stopped. "Virgil, those curves cost you time every pass," Dale Schrupp had said once, leaning on the fence between their properties in the spring of 1974. "I can plant my whole south field in the time it takes you to get around one strip." "You can," Virgil said, "and your water runs straight down to the creek." "Water runs wherever it runs," Schrupp said. "That's what drainage tile is for." "Drainage tile handles what's underneath," Virgil said. "I'm talking about what's on top." He looked at the slope of Schrupp's south field where the straight corn rows ran from the ridge down to the fence line between them. "Rain doesn't go straight," Virgil said. "Never did." Let me explain what Virgil meant, because it is the physics at the center of this story. When rain falls on a hillside faster than the soil can absorb it, the excess becomes surface runoff. On flat ground, runoff is slow and spreads in all directions. On a slope, it follows gravity, which means it follows the path of steepest descent. On a field with rows running up and down the slope, the furrows between the rows are the path of steepest descent. They are already channels, already pointed downhill, already shaped to move water efficiently from high ground to low. What the farmer built for planting efficiency, the rain uses for transport. And here is where the physics becomes severe. The erosive power of moving water, its ability to pick up and carry soil particles, does not increase in proportion to its speed. It increases as the square of its speed. Water moving twice as fast carries 4 times the sediment. Water moving 3 times as fast carries 9 times. On a 6% slope with straight rows funneling runoff into concentrated channels, water that begins moving at 1 foot per second can accelerate to 3 or 4 feet per second before it reaches the field's lower edge. The arithmetic of that acceleration is not kind to topsoil. Contour rows interrupt this entirely. A contour line is a line of equal elevation. It runs neither uphill nor downhill, but perfectly level across the slope. A row planted on a contour line does not offer the water a downhill path. It offers a lateral one. Water that hits a contour strip of wheat or brome grass does not accelerate downhill. It slows. It spreads sideways along the strip. It infiltrates into the soil. Or it moves slowly to the end of the strip, where it can exit the field at a controlled point. Water on a hillside, Virgil told the USDA officer who came out in September of 1993 with his measuring tape and his erosion calculator, is like a crowd leaving a stadium. Give it a straight corridor and it runs. Put barriers across the corridor every 20 feet and people slow down, spread out, stop pushing. My contour strips were the barriers. Dale's farm had nothing but corridors. The USDA Agricultural Research Service had been documenting this for decades. In controlled studies on comparable Iowa hillsides, contour strip farming reduced soil loss by 60 to 75% compared to straight row cultivation under identical rainfall conditions. Virgil did not know those numbers precisely. He knew what his creek looked like after a rain compared to Shrupp's Creek. He had been watching that comparison since 1952. His creek ran clear. Shrupp's ran brown. That was enough to know. Let me tell you about the 6 weeks of summer 1993, because that is the season I want you to see, not as a disaster, but as a slow and irrefutable demonstration of what 40 years of curves had been doing while nobody was paying attention. The rain began in earnest in mid-June. It was not a single event. It was not one storm system or 1 week of unusual weather. It was a persistent atmospheric pattern that parked over the upper Midwest and refused to move. Rain every 3 to 4 days, sometimes every 2, sometimes consecutive, saturating ground that had no capacity left to absorb and producing runoff that had nowhere to go except downhill. In the first week, Virgil walked his upper contour strip after each rain and found it holding. The wheat was bent at the tips from the force of the drops, but the roots held the ground and the ground held the water. Where runoff formed on the slope above the first strip, it slowed when it reached the wheat, spread sideways along the strip, and sank. What reached the edge of the strip and continued downhill met the second strip of corn, then the third strip of wheat below it, each one intercepting what the one above had not fully held. The water that left Virgil's farm entered the creek slowly, in small volumes, relatively clear. On Dale Shrupp's farm, the pattern was different from the first heavy rain. The straight furrows between his corn rows collected the runoff where it fell and directed it downhill with increasing speed. By the end of the first major rain event in late June, Shrupp could see the beginning of rilling, small erosion channels forming between rows where the water had concentrated. He had seen rilling before in bad years. He had not seen it in June. He tiled his fields in the 1970s. The tile handles subsurface water. It does nothing for water moving on the surface, above the soil, in the channels between his rows. By the fourth week of rain, the rills on Shrupp's south field had widened and deepened into gullies, channels 4 to 6 inches deep, 12 to 18 inches across, running straight down the slope like grooves cut by intention. In the worst sections, the topsoil had been cut through entirely, exposing the lighter-colored subsoil below. The subsoil is less fertile, less structured, less capable of supporting the corn roots that were still trying to grow in it. 3 neighboring operations to the north and west of Shrupp's place showed similar patterns. One had gullies 8 inches deep in the steepest section. Another had lost so much surface structure that the corn in the affected rows was visibly smaller than the corn in the rows on the flatter portions of the same field. From the county road that ran between the Shrupp place and the Luxinger place, you could see both farms at once if you stopped at the right point. To the west, Shrupsfield, the straight rows running downhill, the gullies visible as dark lines cutting across the pale yellow-green of the corn canopy, the subsoil showing through in patches, the way a worn rug shows its backing. To the east, Virgil's field, the curved strips alternating between the deeper green of corn and the lighter gold of wheat, the contours following the hillside like a topographic map rendered in two crops. The ground between the strips unbroken, the soil still where it had been in May. A USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service officer named Gerald Foss drove that county road on the morning of July 9th. He was documenting erosion losses across the county for the agency's flood impact assessment. He stopped at the point between the two farms. He got out of his truck. He stood at the road edge for several minutes looking from one field to the other. He had driven 47 farms that week. He had not seen anything like this boundary. He wrote in his field notebook, "Adjacent properties, comparable slopes, comparable rainfall exposure. Erosion, dramatic difference. Left property, surface intact. Right property, severe rill and gully formation throughout sloped sections." Then he wrote, "Need to speak with the operator of the left property." He drove up Virgil's lane that afternoon and found him in the equipment shed, sharpening a disc blade on the old Massey Harris. Virgil heard the truck. He looked up. He did not look surprised. Gerald Foss got out of the government truck with his notebook and his measuring tape still coiled on his belt. He was 36 years old and had a degree in soil science from Iowa State. He had been with the NRCS for 8 years. He had never stood in a field that looked like this in the middle of a flood summer. "Mr. Luxinger," he said, "I've been driving the county for the past 10 days. I've been on 47 properties. I need to ask you what you're doing differently." Virgil set down the sharpening stone. He looked at Foss the way a man looks at a question he has been waiting a long time to be asked by the right person. "I'm not doing anything differently," Virgil said. "I've been doing this the same way since 1952. My father did it the same way since 1931. Foss looked out at the lower strip from the shed door. "The contours held all that water back?" "The contours didn't hold the water back," Virgil said. "They made the water go sideways instead of down. There's a difference." Foss wrote something in his notebook. "Can I walk the field?" he said. "Start at the top," Virgil said. "Walk along the strip, not across it. Stay on the contour line as long as you can. Then you'll understand what I'm talking about." Foss looked at him. "Walk along it," Virgil said again. "The way the water would have to walk if it wanted to go anywhere. You'll see why it can't get downhill fast enough to do any damage." Foss capped his pen and walked toward the upper strip. He was up there for 40 minutes. Virgil finished sharpening the disc blade, cleaned his hands, and went inside to start lunch. When Foss came back down, his boots were clean. On Shrupsfield, his boots would not have been clean. He knocked on the kitchen door. The performance was not a single morning. It was a summer measured in inches. Inches of rain that fell and inches of topsoil that moved, and the specific number of inches that separated what happened on one side of a fence line from what happened on the other. Let me tell you what those numbers looked like, because numbers are the only honest way to tell this story. In the 6 weeks between mid-June and the end of July 1993, The hillside farms of northeast Iowa received rainfall that exceeded anything recorded in the instrumental record for that region. The upper Mississippi crested at Dubuque on July 4th at a level not seen since the 1851 high water mark. On the Shrupp Farm, the South Field, 140 acres on a consistent 6 to 8% slope, straight rows oriented downhill, full moldboard plow tillage, conventional corn, began showing rill erosion in the third week of June. Foss had photographed it on July 7th, 2 days before he drove up Virgil's Lane. The rills in the worst section were 6 inches deep and 14 inches wide, running 30 to 40 feet before merging with adjacent rills into a gully that reached the field's lower edge and deposited its load into the drainage ditch along the county road. The color of the water in that ditch was the color of strong coffee. The suspended sediment load, measured by the county's Soil and Water Conservation District after the rain event, was 2,400 parts per million. The water in the drainage ditch along the lower edge of Virgil's property, which received runoff from the same watershed, the same rain, the same slope, was the color of weak tea. Its suspended sediment load was 180 parts per million. The difference was the contour strips. Not a different soil type, not a different rainfall pattern, not a different slope. The same hillside, one farm managed one way, and the adjacent farm managed another way. And the water told you everything you needed to know about the difference. By the end of July, Foss had completed his assessments on both properties. He came back with his measuring wheel and his soil probe and his field scale. On the Shrupp South Field, his estimate? 6.2 tons of topsoil per acre across 140 acres. 868 tons of soil that had been on that hillside in May and was now somewhere downstream. He crossed the fence line. On the Luxinger lower strip, he found the contour rows intact, the soil surface unbroken between the rows, the corn standing at its normal height and color. The Luxinger strip had lost 0.8 tons per acre. For a moment, Foss looked at that number on his field sheet and looked at the Shrupp number beside it and said nothing. Then he walked back to his truck and sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. 6.2, 0.8, on the same hillside, in the same summer. The difference was not variety selection, or fertilizer application, or tile drainage, or any input that could be bought at the co-op and walk-on. The difference was the shape of the rows and the pattern of the crops, and a decision that Ernst Luxinger had made in the spring of 1931 because a young government officer had come to his door, and he had been curious enough to invite the man in for coffee. Virgil ran his harvest in September with the Massey Harris and a rented combine, the same way he had run every harvest since the mid-1960s. The contour strips came off row by row, each pass curving with the hillside. It was slower than a straight field harvest. It always had been. It always would be. His yield on the lower corn strips was down from the previous year. The summer had been wet and then wet again, and the corn had not been happy about any of it. But the corn had root structure because the root zone had not been undermined by 6-inch gullies. And the topsoil was where it had been in the spring because the strips above it had slowed the water that tried to take it away. On the Shrupp South Field, harvest was difficult in the gullied sections. The combine header could not maintain consistent depth where the surface was irregular. In the sections where the topsoil had been completely removed and the subsoil exposed, the corn had yellowed early and the ears were undersized. Every neighbor in the township ran some version of the same story that September. Every field that had gone into the summer with straight rows running downhill came out of it with less soil than it had started with. Some lost 2 inches. Some lost 4. One farm on a steep section lost enough that the subsoil color was visible across the entire upper half of the field from the county road. Virgil Luxinger's farm came out of the summer of 1993 with the same topsoil it had gone in with. Not more. Not the same quality as an undisturbed prairie, but the same depth, the same structure, the same capacity to grow another crop the following year that it had carried in every year since Ernst had first walked the contours with a surveying level in August of 1931. He did not call anyone to report this. He did not drive to the elevator and walk on to discuss it. He did not write a letter to the extension office. He pulled the John Deere L out of the east shed and drove it up to the ridge to check the upper wheat strip one more time before fall tillage. The strip was intact. The contour stakes Ernst had driven in 1931, the ones Virgil had replaced twice, in 1964 and again in 1978, because wood rots, but the elevation doesn't change, were where they were supposed to be. He reset 2 that had healed over slightly in the saturated ground. Then he drove back down the hill and began planning the fall contour. The curves were the same curves they had always been. Let me tell you about what happened in the autumn of 1993 and through the years that followed, because that is the part of this story that most people in Alamaki County never saw assembled in one place. Gerald Foss filed his field assessment with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Regional Office in October. Most of those reports documented losses. His report from the Luxinger farm was among the few that documented something else. Let me tell you what the numbers showed, because the numbers are the proof, and the proof is why this story exists. Virgil Luxinger, 0.8 tons per acre average erosion loss. Topsoil depth unchanged at probe points. Contour strips intact. Full harvest conducted on normal schedule. No remediation required. Dale Schrupp, 6.2 tons per acre on the south field alone. Across his full 480 acres of hillside ground, Foss estimated total erosion loss at somewhere between 1,800 and 2,400 tons. Iowa topsoil, at its natural rate of formation from parent material, accumulates at roughly 1 inch per 500 years. What the summer of 1993 removed from Schrupp's south field had taken between 4,000 and 6,000 years to form. It would not be coming back. 3 other operations in the township averaged between 4 and 8 tons per acre loss across their sloped acreage. One farm on the steepest ground, a 12% slope farmed straight row for 22 years, lost enough surface that the County Soil and Water Conservation District recommended it be taken out of row crop production entirely. The owner planted corn on it again in 1994. The corn grew poorly on the exposed subsoil. He converted it to pasture in 1995. In December of 1993, Foss drove back to the Luxinger place and asked Virgil if he would allow the NRCS to designate the farm as an official demonstration site for the agency's contour farming educational program. Virgil considered the request for a moment. "The sign can go at the lane entrance," he said. "Not in the field," Foss agreed. Dale Schrupp drove past the new sign 3 weeks after it went up. He slowed. He read it. He drove on. In the spring of 1994, he came to Virgil's kitchen door for the first time since the Farm Bureau picnic 27 years earlier. He had a legal pad with questions written on it. He sat at the kitchen table for most of a Saturday afternoon, asking about contour intervals, strip widths, how to handle the ends of strips where the curves tightened, what equipment Virgil recommended for the narrow sections. Virgil answered every question. He drew diagrams on the legal pad. He told Schrupp to call Gerald Foss for the technical survey work. He did not mention the picnic in 1967. He did not mention the phrase about the tractor going straight now. He did not mention the 26 years of being the man who couldn't drive straight. When Schrupp stood up to leave, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "I should have asked these questions in 1961, he said. Virgil refilled his coffee cup. "Sit down, Dale," he said. "There's more on the legal pad." Schrupp sat back down. The conversion of the Schrupp South field to contour strips took 3 seasons to complete and cost approximately $45 per acre in survey work, new fencing, and the yield loss from the transition years. It was the most expensive farming decision Dale Schrupp had made since he bought the 1206 tractor in 1966. The curves Virgil farmed held through the summer of 1993. The straight lines his neighbors had driven did not. This story draws from real American agricultural history. The Great Flood of 1993, one of the most severe flood events in United States history, affecting 9 states and causing between $15 and $20 billion in damages. The documented relationship between contour strip farming and soil erosion reduction, as established by USDA Agricultural Research Service studies, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service's post-1993 expansion of contour farming demonstration programs across the upper Midwest. Virgil Luchsinger, Dale Schrupp, Gerald Foss, and all other characters are fictional and created for storytelling purposes. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. Did your family farm on hillside ground? Do you remember whether they farmed up and down the hill or along the curves? Tell us in the comments.